In the scorching summer of 1942, the strategic focus of the Second World War on the Eastern Front shifted from the political center of Moscow to the vast, resource-rich steppes of southern Russia. Under the operational code name Case Blue, the German High Command launched a dual-pronged offensive designed to decisively break the military-industrial back of the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler, increasingly preoccupied with the material requirements of a prolonged war of attrition, directed his panzer armies toward two critical objectives: the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, and the massive oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler famously and repeatedly declared to his top military commanders that if Germany did not secure the oil of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, he would be forced to end the war. This was not a hyperbolic statement but a cold, mathematical assessment of Germany's desperate fuel deficit. The Third Reich was almost entirely dependent on synthetic oil production and imports from Romania's Ploiești oil fields, which were logistically inadequate to power a global, multi-front mechanized war. The Caucasus region represented the ultimate prize, producing over 80% of the Soviet Union's domestic oil supply, with Baku alone generating over 24 million tons of crude oil annually. To capture this resource, Hitler divided his southern forces into two independent commands, a decision that violated classical military principles of concentration of force. Army Group B, under General Maximilian von Weichs, was tasked with securing the Volga flank and capturing Stalingrad, while Army Group A, under the command of Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, was ordered to cross the Don River and drive deep into the rugged Caucasus Mountains to seize the oil fields. This split of Axis military power would prove to be the fatal operational flaw of the summer campaign, but in this counterfactual investigation, we explore the terrifying strategic reality of a German victory. What if Army Group A had bypassed the stubborn Soviet mountain defenses, avoided the supply bottlenecks, and successfully captured both Grozny and Baku in late 1942, severing the Soviet Union from its lifeblood? The hypothetical capture of Grozny and Baku in late 1942 would have required Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army to execute a series of daring, lightning advances that bypassed the main Soviet defensive lines along the Terek River and the High Caucasus passes. Historically, the German advance ground to a halt due to extreme supply shortages, treacherous mountainous terrain, and fierce resistance by the Soviet Transcaucasus Front. However, in our counterfactual scenario, we assume that the 1st Panzer Army successfully secured a series of bridges across the Terek River near Mozdok, enabling their armored columns to sweep rapidly eastward through the Grozny oil fields and down the Caspian Sea coast through Makhachkala, eventually encircling Baku from the landward side. The immediate Soviet reaction to this threat would have been a massive, desperate attempt at total industrial sabotage, duplicating the scorched earth tactics that successfully neutralized the Maikop oil fields in August. Historically, the Soviet state had prepared elaborate plans to dynamite every major drilling rig, seal the active wells with thousands of tons of quick-drying cement, dismantle the refining columns, and set fire to the vast oil reservoirs to deny the resource to the enemy. Even if the specialized German oil extraction units, organized under the Technical Brigade Mineralol, managed to prevent absolute destruction and capture a portion of the infrastructure intact, the immediate consequence for the Axis war effort would have been a long-term engineering project rather than an instant fuel bonanza. Restoring oil production in a sabotaged Baku would have taken many months, if not years, of intensive labor, requiring Germany to transport heavy drilling machinery, chemical reagents, and specialized engineers over thousands of miles of overextended rail lines. Yet, the primary strategic impact of the fall of Baku was not what Germany gained, but the absolute, catastrophic loss that the Soviet Union suffered, plunging the Soviet state into an unprecedented resource crisis that threatened to paralyze its entire military and civilian infrastructure. The immediate loss of 80% of the Soviet Union's domestic oil supply would have triggered a catastrophic economic and social crisis behind the front lines, beginning with the total collapse of Soviet agriculture. Unlike the Tsarist Empire of the First World War, the Soviet Union of 1942 was a highly industrialized, collective agricultural system that depended entirely on mechanization to feed its massive population and military. The thousands of state-run machine and tractor stations, or MTS, which house the tractors, trucks, and combines necessary to cultivate the vast grain belts of the Volga, the Urals, and western Siberia, ran exclusively on fuel oil, kerosene, and diesel. Without a constant, massive flow of refined oil from the Caucasus, these tractors would have been permanently immobilized, leaving millions of acres of fertile soil unplowed and unharvested. The Red Army had already requisitioned millions of horses for military logistics, and the civilian population had largely slaughtered their remaining livestock for food, leaving virtually no draft animals to replace the dead tractors. This fuel famine would have forced the Soviet leadership to organize a brutal, manual labor mobilization, forcing millions of women, children, and elderly citizens into the fields to dig and harvest crops by hand, an incredibly inefficient process that would have resulted in widespread, severe famine across the major cities and industrial centers of the Urals and Siberia. Furthermore, the Soviet transportation network, which relied on the Volga River barge route to carry millions of tons of Baku oil northward to the heavy industries of Moscow and the Urals, would have been completely severed, paralyzing the internal distribution of raw materials, chemical lubricants, and industrial machinery, and threatening to shut down the very factories that manufactured the weapons of war. In this desperate situation, the Soviet leadership would have turned with frantic urgency to the Volga-Ural oil region, a vast geological zone historically designated as the Second Baku. Discovered in the early 1930s, this area, stretching across Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, and the Kuyabyshev Oblast, possessed immense oil reserves that would eventually make it the center of Soviet post-war petroleum production. However, in the winter of 1942, the Second Baku was a strategic mirage, completely incapable of replacing the lost Caucasus fields. The region's actual production was still in its absolute infancy, generating barely a fraction of Baku's output due to a severe shortage of drilling rigs, specialized technical equipment, and skilled oil workers, many of whom had been drafted into the army or were trapped inside the Caucasus pocket. Furthermore, the geological conditions of the Volga-Ural fields were far more challenging than those of Baku. The oil deposits lay deeper underground, encased in hard limestone and dolomite layers that required heavy rotary drilling equipment and specialized chemical reagents that the Soviet Union could no longer manufacture in sufficient quantities. The Soviet oil minister, Nikolai Baibakov, would have been ordered by Joseph Stalin to execute extreme, desperate measures, utilizing thousands of Gulag prisoners to manually construct new pipelines, dismantle small regional refineries, and transport them to the Urals, and implement high-pressure water injection to force the shallowest wells to yield their final drops of oil. Yet, despite these brutal, state-directed efforts, the physical limitations of geology and industrial machinery in late 1942 meant that the Second Baku could not possibly scale up production fast enough to prevent a systemic national fuel collapse, leaving the Soviet war machine completely exposed to an impending mechanical paralysis. Faced with a total domestic oil collapse, the survival of the Soviet Union would have depended entirely on the massive expansion of Allied Lend-Lease imports, turning the Persian corridor into the ultimate logistical lifeline of the anti-fascist coalition. Historically, the United States and Great Britain supplied the Soviet Union with over 500,000 tons of high-octane aviation gasoline and refined lubricants, which were critical in keeping the Red Air Force flying. However, if Baku and Grozny had fallen, the Soviets would have required not just specialty aviation fuel, but millions of tons of basic industrial diesel, tractor kerosene, and heavy marine fuel oil just to keep their society functioning. The primary source for this massive fuel supply would have been the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's massive refinery at Abadan in the Persian Gulf, the largest oil refinery in the world. Yet, transporting these immense volumes of liquid fuel northward across the rugged, mountainous terrain of Iran and into the Soviet republics of Central Asia presented an almost insurmountable logistical nightmare. The Trans-Iranian Railway and the primitive truck roads of the Persian corridor were already operating at their absolute physical capacity, transporting steel, explosives, locomotives, and food. To redirect this strained network to carry millions of tons of liquid fuel would have required a massive, non-existent fleet of specialized rail tank cars and heavy tanker trucks. This logistical conflict would have forced the Allied leadership into a series of agonizing, high-stakes decisions. Every ton of petroleum shipped north through the Persian corridor meant one less ton of Sherman tanks, aluminum, boots, or canned meat, forcing the Allies to drastically scale back their direct military shipments and leaving the Red Army severely under-equipped just as they faced the full weight of the undefeated German Wehrmacht. The long-term military and strategic consequences of a Soviet fuel starvation in 1943 would have fundamentally altered the course and duration of the war on the Eastern Front, paralyzing the Red Army's offensive capabilities. Historically, the Soviet military was transforming into a highly modernized, fast-moving mechanized juggernaut, organizing massive tank armies and independent mechanized corps that utilized deep operational maneuvers to encircle and destroy entire German army groups. These massive armored formations were heavy consumers of diesel and motor petrol, and their mobility was entirely dependent on a massive fleet of American-supplied Studebaker trucks. Without fuel to power these engines, the Red Army would have been forced to freeze its modernization program, restricting its military operations to slow, localized, infantry-heavy attacks supported by animal-drawn logistics. The grand, sweeping offensives that historically broke the back of the Wehrmacht, such as the massive counter-offensives at Kursk and the drive to the Dnieper River, would have been logistically impossible to execute. Meanwhile, the German Army Group South would have secured an immense strategic breathing room. With the Soviet forces immobilized and starving, the Germans could have concentrated their remaining armored reserves on key sectors, fortified their defensive lines along the Don and Volga, and methodically worked to restore oil production in the Caucasus. This prolonged stalemate on the Eastern Front would have delayed the defeat of Nazi Germany by several years, forcing the Western Allies to shoulder a far greater share of the military burden in Europe. Ultimately, the counterfactual of the Baku oil collapse demonstrates that the outcome of the Second World War was decided not merely by the tactical bravery of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, but by the cold, unyielding realities of resource geography and logistical flow.